It's on? Hello? Okay. Okay, well, welcome to the last session of the last day. The marathon is almost over. So I commend you for trying to sponge in a little more information during this conference, and I hope you'll find this worthwhile and stimulating. First, I'd like to ask a few survey questions. I'd sent out an email as I wasn't really sure where people were at with perhaps what they'd saw yesterday. So first off, how many people stayed extra late last night and watched Mike's presentation? Okay, so just a handful. Okay, good. How many people have done some sort of agile development? Show of hands. About half the room. How many would say they know what Scrum is, or they've used Scrum? Okay, so this introducing Scrum is probably a good place to start. Welcome. Hey, Jean-Paul. Come on in. Okay, well, let's dive right in. So my name is Jerry Kirk, and I work with If People, and I would call myself sort of a team coach and a client manager, or in agile terms, product owner / Scrum Master. I've been using Plone, or been part of the Plone community since about 2002. And this is my first Plone conference. So very excited to be here and excited to give something back a bit to the Plone community about a topic that I'm very passionate about and like to share and evangelize about. So, and as you can tell, I'm a bit of an ultimate Frisbee nut. That's my one release to get me away from the computer. And so I figured on the last day, the last session, to make sure that everybody stays alive and stimulated. This is my question disc. So anyone who has a question, better be alert. So please stand up, and I will toss you the disc. And if you catch it, I may answer it correctly. If you don't, you may want to get a second opinion. So basically, I want to try to have a little bit of fun today. Keep it lively. I know the capacity to absorb information at this point is nearing the bottom. So we'll try to keep it light. So why consider Scrum from what you're doing right now? Here's some things that I think that are particularly important to know about Scrum, and we'll get into what Scrum is in a moment. First off, it's a very simple framework. When I first got introduced to Scrum, I thought, wow, this is just common sense stuff, but it's kind of packaged together in a way that I can use it, right? There's not a lot of new stuff here in a sense, but somehow it just kind of enables it to happen more easily. It fosters collaboration. When you use Agile or Scrum with a team and a client, you spend a lot more time in conversations. You really involve the client in an ongoing basis, something that you might not see in other processes. Productivity boost. These numbers come from Jeff Sutherland, who's the co-founder of Scrum. And based on his research, a team that's kind of doing Scrum and just getting some of the basics can expect a boost of about 25%. When you get really good at Scrum and you move from kind of Scrum but not quite doing everything to like high-performing Scrum, there are teams in Russia and in Scandinavia that have seen a boost of 400% in productivity, which is a huge boost to your bottom line. Embraces change. I think that's really one of the key things about Agile and Scrum is things keep changing. And how do we adjust to that? How do we adapt in a way that doesn't burden us down and allows us to deal with changing requirements, changing circumstances? How do we do that? And delivers by value. So Scrum is more about making sure that the client gets what they need the most, more than trying to follow a schedule. So when you're dealing with Scrum, you basically try to focus on the highest value things first and get those done, and leave the stuff that's, well, we're not quite sure if we want to get to it to the very end. So you're always focusing on, if you've got deadlines and you're not going to meet those deadlines, at least the stuff you've done up to that point is the stuff that the client really wanted in the first place. Again, as we go along, if you have any questions, please just raise your hand. For those who aren't here, I wouldn't sit too far back because I have a question disc that I will use for anyone who has a question, just to sort of make sure everyone's alive and well. So this is a diagram of basically the parts of Scrum. So we start off on the far left with what we call a product backlog. And really what that is a list of features. And we'll talk a bit more about what that is in a second. But then we then take this big long list, right? All these wish list things that the client wants to do that will take far more time than anyone could want to spend on it. And we'll break it down into something smaller, into what we call a sprint. And those sprints typically last 2 to 4 weeks. So you time box the work you're going to do for your client, and you pick a smaller subset, in this case what we call a sprint backlog, and that's what you're going to focus on during that sprint. At the end of that time, what you end up with is finished working code. So something that's been spec'd, that's been coded, designed, it's got a visual UI, it's been tested. Basically, if there was enough in place, the client could say, okay, we're done. I've got enough, let's put it live. During that iteration time, your team will get together every day in what's called a daily Scrum meeting to kind of check in on things. So that's, in essence, the parts of Scrum. The one that's not here, that also happens in an iteration, is what we call a review or a retrospective at the end of the sprint. And that gives the team a chance to reflect on what's gone well, what's not gone so well, so that they can continue to get better at what they do. Yes. Oh, hang on. Oh, ready?
Okay. 2 to 4 weeks. You said that yesterday as well. How do you say that? Do you start the sprint backlog and say, okay, this might be 2 to 4 weeks, and we're done after 2 weeks, it's fine, and then you take in new stuff, or do you just say, okay, this has been planned for 2 weeks, so we're done now? And what do you do when you're not finished?
Well, your team will agree on a length, whatever seems to, what they think will work best. If they've never done Scrum, then it's just going to be a bit of a guess in the dark. Teams will find a certain rhythm. It's really about, Scrum is not about dictating a certain set of rules. It's about a framework. So teams will find their sweet spot. They may try 3 weeks for a while and finding, well, that's a bit too long. And then they switch to 2, and that kind of gives them the right pace to work within. So, basically, every sprint, you've got some planning going on at the start, some review at the end. So there's a certain flow that happens. So some teams will want to stretch that out, and some teams won't. But you basically stay within that time box. If you don't get some things done, then that's part of the learning process. Maybe next time you need to take on a bit less. Or maybe there's some circumstances that happen that usually don't happen. That's what you'll do during your review. Try to figure out what went wrong and how to address it for the next sprint. Okay, any other questions? Okay. So now we'll start to delve into a bit of those parts in more detail. This is just a very basic Excel spreadsheet. A lot of teams use very simple tools for Scrum. So here we have Project Grocery Trip, and this is what I'm calling my backlog. You'll see there's not a lot of detail here. We have what we call a list of stories, and stories are basically small bits of functionality that are easy to implement. They're not huge pieces. And you will have your client or your product owner rank those in order of importance so that the things you focus on first are the things that matter most to them. On the far right, you can see that there's a planned estimate or points. And basically what happens here is your team takes a look at those stories and tries to figure out how big are they. And the reason why you think about size instead of, how much time is research has shown we really suck at guessing how long something takes. Or, basically measuring something. There were some examples of, people trying to guess how tall the Empire State Building was. It would go from anywhere from, a few hundred meters to maybe like a mile. But what we're really good at saying is, how big is this thing compared to this thing? Right? We can say, well, it looks like this is about maybe 3 times the size of this. That we can figure out pretty quickly and agree to. So your planning will go much faster if you just focus on relative size of things. So here we can see we've got 3, 5, 1, 2, 2, 3. So basically, that first story is about 3 times the size as bring money to pay for groceries. That's what we're doing here. And that's our planning. And then basically, we'll take the size of things, and we'll then, as a team, figure out, well, how many of these things do we think we can get done in a sprint? Maybe we can get 20 points worth done. And that helps us figure out our plan. So we've got our total amount of points, and then how many points can we get done? That's our velocity. And that determines how many iterations we need to carry out the entire plan. Oh. Points are about as real as the Plone Pony. Any team can decide what they want to use for points. Some people use t-shirt sizes. We tend to use Fibonacci sequence, so we'll estimate like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. Well, Fibonacci, the reason sometimes Fibonacci is used, it's sometimes if you say like you double, like 1, 2, 4, 8, and so on, sometimes it's, well, I'm not sure exactly why, but sometimes if you're using Fibonacci, they're starting to get slightly bigger, like they're more than twice the size of the previous one.
How are you using that Fibonacci sequence? Is that the basis for your initial estimate?
Well,
I don't understand.
Sure.
I don't understand how it applies at all.
You don't want to obsess over the granularity of something that
right.
is 8 or 9. You don't obsess over the granularity of
If
Right.
I'm correct, the Fibonacci is based on the cone of uncertainty, right? Amount of risk
Sure,
that
yeah.
is involved,
Right.
and Fibonacci kind of matches that curve.
Right.
That's
Go team. Yes, that's a good way to explain it. That's exactly it, because they will get increasingly larger. And the point here is, because we're using relative sizing here, it also makes it very clear we don't know a lot here. We're really just guessing ballparks, right? The client shouldn't expect this to be pretty like down to the penny, how much time it's going to take. It helps to convey the fact that we're just at the start of our project. We know as much as your vague requirement that you gave us, right? So it actually helps to educate them that way too. So I wasn't going to talk too much about planning poker, but that's basically how these things come together, where you get a team together, and they each have like a set of cards. There's actually an online version that we use, and basically everyone picks a card, trying to figure out how big the size they think it is, and you try to get some agreement within the team as to the size. So these are always done as a team. You don't have one person figuring out the size, and that's been really great. When we started doing that with our teams, it was a lot of fun because sometimes you get huge variations, and we're like, why do you think that's a 13 when everyone else is at a 5? And they bring some new piece of information that no one's thought about. And we're like, oh yeah. So then you may end up with the team agreeing that it's now an 8. So it really helps to get much better estimates when you're doing it as a team. Okay, where'd my disc go? Do I have my disc? Excellent. We'll have a Plone Ultimate Frisbee team by the end of this presentation. So the other thing I was going to mention is there's sort of 3 parts to putting together your stories. Card, conversation, and confirmation. So your card, oftentimes these are done on little index cards. You'll see the titles of these things, there's not a lot of details. Bring reusable bags so I can avoid plastic ones. Well, what does that involve? The point here, and the point with Agile and Scrum, is you can't convey everything in writing. You can sort of get a general idea, but it's really important to talk about what's needed. And I know that's saved me and the teams I've worked with so many times to continue to have those conversations with clients. Sometimes when you get a really detailed spec, it provides a perception that you've got everything, and that someone who reads it is going to understand what you meant, and most of the time that's not going to be the case. The confirmation side is, how do we know when the story is complete? How do we know when we've met the expectations of the client? And so part of this will include a bunch of acceptance tests that basically say, so for example, let's go back one. So, assure the van has enough gas so I can get home. Well, the acceptance test would be, I got home. Or, bring money to pay for groceries. Well, the acceptance test there could be, that I actually have the money on hand, right? However much that I need. So these acceptance tests are things that are testable, that are often written as automated tests, often through the web, that kind of stuff. And basically, what it also is nice about them is you can agree with your client sometimes to say, whatever the acceptance tests are, this is the criteria for it being done. There's no subjectivity about, well, you missed this or you didn't do that. If you say, whatever's written as acceptance tests is the definition of done, and we pass all those things, we're done, which is often good in negotiating with clients. Came out a bit dark. As I was saying, the team estimates together. Everything's done as a team, and I can't stress how important that is in coming up with good estimates and also with sort of a team attitude of getting things done. So the team will look at this list of stories that's in the backlog, and they'll start estimating them. During these planning meetings, typically you take these vague estimates and points and convert them into hours. So you start creating your tasks, and you say, okay, well, it's going to be 2 hours for UI, it's going to be 3 hours for testing, and 4 hours for coding. And they'll go through, and until they realize, we can't take on any more in this 2 weeks. We've got 200 hours as a team. We've reached, say, 170. We want to keep a little bit of a buffer. That's all we're going to be willing to do. But it's the team that's deciding that. It's not a project manager, not anyone else. It's the team saying, okay, we're going to get this much done. This is what we commit to doing. And that really provides some motivation and buy-in to really deliver. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay. So I thought, especially this being the last session, we could try and do just a short exercise that would kind of illustrate some of the things we're talking about today. So what I need are a few pairs of people who'd like to come up, and then I'll explain the game. It's very, very simple. So just come on up, whoever wants to come, and find a partner. And maybe I could get someone who has a watch we can use for a stopwatch.
My phone has to get out.
Okay. Well, just someone else in the audience who wants to keep track of time. Okay. All right. Brian's our taskmaster. So everyone got a partner? Cool. Okay. So this game is called 60 Paces from tastycupcakes.com. So one of you is a manager, one of you is a worker, so work that out between you. Okay, so for 2 minutes, the manager is going to instruct the person on what to do as they walk, and the idea is to get to 60 paces, okay, within the 2 minutes. The only commands you can use are go, stop, left, right, faster, slower, okay? So,
Who's counting the paces?
well, the person walking should probably be counting. Sure. Okay, so any questions?
Any direction?
That's up to the manager. Okay, all right, so you ready?
Yes.
And got our timer ready? Okay, all right, let's go.
Right. Go. Stop.
Left.
Stop. Left.
Well, I didn't say go, but you
Oh,
can
no,
go.
stop.
Wait, left. Left again?
Go. Stop.
Go.
Go. Go. Stop. Stop. Right.
Go.
Go.
Go. Go. Oh, stop. Go. Faster, faster. Go back. Slower.
Faster, faster. Faster, slower, slower, stop. Stop, left. Go. Left. Left. Go. Stop, left. Stop. Stop, right.
Left.
Go.
Stop at 60. I don't know.
Stop,
You made it to 60?
right.
Good job. Okay,
Go.
yeah, you can stop.
Stop, left.
Accumulated distance.
Go.
We done?
Stop. Yes. 40 seconds. About 60?
Okay.
Probably.
Thank you.
Did you guys all finish?
He lost count,
I
but
lost
I
count.
think we got about 60. I think we got about 60.
I was not a very good employee.
In the hole when I had 60. And he said stop.
You're fired.
Just by chance. Exactly on the 60.
He almost ran into something. You're following pretty literally.
Yeah.
I was trying to get a collision between you and the other team going on.
And run against the door.
Like a safety override.
Yeah, Chris is just dragging with him.
Okay, well.
How did everybody make it to 60 before us?
Okay, so everyone made it to 60. Okay. Now we're going to try this game again, but now everyone's part of the team. There are no managers. So basically, you just decide what you want to do. And Brian, what I'd like you to do this time, since everyone made it in 2 minutes, is actually keep track of how long it takes. So when everybody's done, let us know how long that takes. Okay? So again, you're a self-managed team. So
Just one
you
person
just
walking?
no, you all walk on your own. Everyone gets to 60 steps. Okay.
How do we work together?
No, just decide individually how you're going to walk. Okay? So you are your own manager.
Your own manager, or you can only.
But are we working as a team?
You're your own manager. You walk
There are-
wherever you want to go.
That's right.
Walk like normal people.
So what's the point of having a pair then?
You're not paired up anymore.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Just have to get 60.
Okay. So you're right.
First person to 60, I stop this? Or?
When everybody's done. Okay? Ready? All right, let's give a hand for our volunteers. And Brian, how do we do?
35 seconds.
35 seconds. So any observations on the one process from the other? Which one was more efficient?
Managing takes time.
Smaller steps.
Uh-huh.
Get to the goal.
Uh-huh.
Which I think is a metaphor for something that I don't know what exactly. Except for maybe something functional, right?
Well,
Lines of code as a judgment word. If you know that's a judgment.
uh-huh.
You want all to go to the same place?
What's that?
You want everybody to go to the same place?
Mm-hmm. What about going to the same place?
I don't know, do you need, I mean, I don't understand.
Okay.
You need somebody to tell everybody to go to the same place, so you need a manager who wants everybody to go.
Well, we did all have a goal that came from someone else. We had to take 60 steps.
Yes, Kurt?
Did we all accidentally just end up at the front of the room at the end of 60 steps, or was it somehow subliminally planned?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting observation. When you controlled your own direction, you managed where you went and you ended up where you wanted to be in the end. It's just a very simple exercise, but really what it's meant to show is that when you sort of got a command and control approach, and if we'd done this in 60 seconds, if that was the deadline, that I think would have been even more obvious, because we would have had a lot of people who didn't make their 60 steps in 60 seconds. This is my first time trying this, so thanks for experimenting. So really what it's trying to show you is that a self-managed team can actually be far more efficient and more motivated and get to where they need to go than somebody trying to control a group of a team towards a destination. Is that Luke? Hey, nice to see you. Been hoping to see you this conference.
I had a thought about everyone ending up at front of the room, and maybe you said subliminally or someone mentioned subliminally. Maybe they were thinking, well, that's going to make it easier for the person keeping track of the time to know that everyone's completed their 60 days. So
Mm-hmm.
checking in with whatever regulator, the person that needs to know if everyone's finished.
Right, right. Yeah, okay.
Another thought I had was if you had one person who is directing 5 or 6 people to try to take 60 steps,
Right.
and only use those words,
Uh-huh.
it would be
Much more
easier to get
chaos.
60 steps.
Sure. Yeah, good point. Great. So I've got another game here, which we'll get back to if we have time, but I don't think we'll have time. That was more if I needed to abandon most of my slides, which I haven't had to do. So the daily check-ins. These are really, really simple, but really, really valuable, especially if you're like me and I work with distributed teams. The daily check-in coordinates and surfaces problems early before they bite you much harder later. It's meant to be a 15-minute session, so not a lot of time. Basically 3 questions. What did you do since our last stand-up? What are you doing today? And do you have any obstacles in your way? And so what that does is it gets everyone on the same page. So as a team, you can see if there's somebody kind of straying in a bad direction, or sometimes if somebody's going to work on something, then someone else can say, well, I've got some experience with that. I could help you with that. Or maybe somebody's struggling to get some tests done. Somebody can pitch in then to get that story done. Or someone's got a problem. That often happens. So you can decide as a group, okay, who's going to talk about it after our stand-up and try to resolve that issue earlier than later. So they're really, really, really helpful. And I've also found they're really, really good to get time updated, which developers hate to do. But we use our daily check-ins to kind of see where we're at, and I'll show you in a minute how we do that with what's called a burn-down chart. So I'll just keep going unless anyone raises a hand. Again, it's the team talking to each other. It's not them reporting to a manager, right? They're working together as a self-managed team, ideally. We're not fully there yet ourselves. But so the question is, how are those done? And Nate's asking from a distributed point of view. Obviously, if you were all working in the same office, you would just get together and chat. With the teams that I work with, the developers are in Argentina. I'm in Canada. So we have to use, non-face-to-face tools. We try to use voice as much as we can. IRC is just, sometimes IRC, if we're really quick about it, because it's usually just a quick report. We'll usually have our text ready to go and paste it in IRC, so we're not wasting time lagging on people doing stuff. So yeah, actually, IRC can work pretty well for that. I prefer voice if possible. Voice doesn't always work very well in Argentina with their crappy infrastructure. So you want to try to mimic as much as possible when you're distributed that in-person feel. So how do we know where we're at during our iteration or even in the whole release? Well, we use what's called a burn-down chart. It's very visual. It's very easy to do. On the far left side, we start with all the sum of the tasks that we figure we're going to need to do for this sprint. So we look at all the stories, we add up all the hours, and it comes to 600. And hopefully, by the end of our sprint, this is a month sprint here, by the end of our sprint, we're at 0, right? We've gotten everything done, and there's no time remaining. Of course, as we're moving along, we will discover new things, right? What we thought was 2 hours might turn into a 5-hour task, or maybe we'd find some tool that we can, or pre-written software that we can use that will cut down our time. So this will fluctuate. Sometimes we'll be ahead of schedule, sometimes we'll be behind, but it's basically tracking our time remaining. So on a daily basis, people who are working on the team are putting in their hours basically in terms of how much is remaining. It's not so much about tracking what I've done, but what's left to do. If you're a contractor, you might have to track your actual, but actual is not really important. It's more about what's left to get done, so that we can see earlier on, surfacing as early as possible any potential problems. If we're not going to hit our date, then maybe we need to talk to the client about simplifying some stories halfway through the iteration as opposed to at the end and saying, well, we couldn't get everything done. Or maybe we need to drop a story. Or in the best case scenario, hey, we're way ahead. We can actually pull in a couple stories, which happens about once every 7 or 8 months. Any questions about this one? Okay. Oh, I don't know if I want to throw that far. Well, actually, I do, but.
All right.
The chart that just mentioned.
Yes.
In the first slide, we saw that you estimate your tasks and give them a difficulty and a kind of amount of jobs specified in terms of budget. So how do you know how much budget or man hours you have burned here or estimate?
Well, the question was about budget. I mean, you've got an estimate in hours, so typically you would know what your rate is, your hourly rate, that sort of thing, if I'm understanding you correctly. I mean, this is trying to track work to be done during a sprint. So, in terms of budget, we've already ideally figured out how many iterations we can afford to do for the client. And we know the cost per iteration roughly by how many hours we're going to spend every iteration, and multiplying that by our rate. So that would.
You are tracking the time every day. We have spent that many developers times our daily rate.
Oh, you mean in order to figure out what to build a client?
How to build the chart.
The chart is not based on actual time. It's based on time remaining.
That means actual budget minus actual, right?
Well, it really just means what's the realistic picture to get things done today. We may have a story that we thought was going to be 10 hours, but as we get into that story, we realize it's going to take us 20 hours. So this chart is going to reflect that. As we get things done, right, a task will go down to 0 when it's complete. So that will be reflected in the chart. It's always the time remaining. So as we get things done, those hours on time remaining on those tasks are getting smaller. But as we discover bottlenecks or issues, then our time might go up on something. And so this chart will reflect those variations. Okay. Please. Everyone else might want to talk. Excellent. You guys should have been here on Tuesday when we were playing Ultimate outside. Okay, there was another question. Yes?
I assume you're working on multiple projects at a time. So practically, how do you, if something goes off course in one project, how do you manage the impact from the other projects?
So the question is, how do you manage impact if you've got people working on multiple projects? Well, the first answer is don't work on multiple projects, which is easy to say. But seriously, really think about it. We had a similar situation in the company at If People, largely before I started there, where people were context switching so much, and we're working with companies in Argentina that have their own projects. We're partners with them, so they're not just doing If People work. And so what we started doing to address some of that right away was reducing the amount of projects they were on. If you've got a lot of projects that just have to get done on a certain date, one option is to switch between sprints and make the sprints smaller. So if you've got, say, 2 projects that have an urgent deadline coming up in, say, 2 months, instead of doing the 2 simultaneously, do one for 2 weeks, take a break, do the other one for 2 weeks, and have the focus, that focus for the 2 weeks to be really, really productive on that project. That's one way to address it, but really it's about not doing multiple projects as much as possible. Okay, this is actually a fun part I find with Scrum is at the end of our 2 weeks, we sit down with the client, virtually in our case, and we have the team or someone on the team show off what's been done, a little show and tell back to kindergarten. And we'll show the working pieces of software, which is great for the client because it's very tangible. They can see the progress. And great for the team because they feel good. I mean, they're getting good positive affirmation from the client in most cases. And it's also a way to generate new thoughts, new questions. We often generate new things in the backlog based on these demonstrations. Something that wasn't thought of, or maybe a way to improve it the next time. Again, with Agile, it's not always about getting it right the first time, but it's about continuous refining and refactoring. So those working software demonstrations will help facilitate that. Apologize for some of these being too dark.
How do you get clients to get to these meetings? My experience is they are terribly lazy when it comes to like keeping appointments. They want to like talk to you on the phone all the time, but to get them sit down and have you show them something, I find that.
In our case, when we've introduced Scrum to, well, we don't necessarily even call it Scrum to clients, but we explain our process, that hasn't been too much of a problem. In fact, in some ways, they look forward to it, right? It's a lot of fun. They're seeing their project evolving. Instead of waiting months and months for stuff, they're seeing working pieces done, and they actually enjoy that. But we also make it very clear what our expectations are of them in our process. If you're going to work with us, this is what we need you to do. We need you to participate in our planning meetings because the team will have questions. We need you to help with writing the acceptance tests and so on and so on. We're actually also working with Jeff Sutherland right now, again, the co-founder of Scrum, on an Agile contract, which would basically embed into it some of the Agile Scrum practices that have to be adhered to with incentives for which to do so. Which is another topic in itself. But it hasn't really been an issue. In our case, we never do face-to-face. It's always using screen sharing. So it's not like they're driving to come see us. So that also makes it easier. I mean, our developers in Argentina, our clients are in the US. So we just set up a Skype call and do screen sharing, or just point them to the website on the dev server and give them a bunch of links to click on. It's not a long meeting either. It's typically, no more than an hour, maybe less. You're showing maybe 5 or 6 stories that are done. Yes, maybe you want to toss it back.
How do you handle non-visual software like migration scripts or stuff you can't really easily define?
So the question is, well, we did a bunch of cool stuff that has no visual pizzazz. How do we show it to the client? Well, one thing you could do is you could run your tests, right? Again, we have acceptance tests. So it's not as exciting, but you're trying to show the client that you actually did what you said you would do. So if you have tests that will run and will have statistics and things, we had X number of objects here, we move them over here, we can show that they've been moved over here, we can look at maybe we can create a visual to show the data or something. Those are the kinds of things you could do. But I mean, again, if you're migrating content, usually that content gets presented somehow. So I would think you could show that content in the new place, for example, as well. So there are particular roles in Scrum. One of them is called a Scrum Master, which sounds a bit like Jedi Master. It's not quite that glorious. That's a lot of what I do. Basically, trying to guide and help the team be productive. So being a coach, not being a controller. And so it's someone who understands the practices of Scrum, will help them learn and get better at using them, helps the team be productive. So again, helps remove impediments. So if somebody needs some hardware, he's going to help make sure that happens if there's problems. Yes? Oh my. Okay. Thanks, we had a lot of good questions. I've got a little bit more, but... I'm not leaving. Okay. Okay, so I'll just move a little more quickly here. So again, so a Scrum Master is more of the coach. You know, yay, go team, go. Ideally you want a cross-functional team, right? So people who've got different skills and whatnot, but also a team where you can pitch in and help each other, right? Not where, you know, this is all that I do and this is all that I do. But the idea is you pitch in, you get the stories done. You're not a bunch of silo developers. You're working with one purpose as a team to solve your problems. I'm almost done here. So the other parts of the secret sauce are the proven engineering practices, test-driven development, continuous integration, pair programming. These are really no-brainers in terms of whether you should do them. I'm not going to talk about how you would do them, but they're just proven to work and work really, really well. So if you want a high-performing team, you've got to look at doing these. Can tools help? Well, sometimes. Oftentimes, this is what teams use to track their work. Very, very, very simple. If you're working in one place, one physical location, you can have your backlog on the left-hand side, your tasks across the middle to be done. You can have your in progress and your completed stuff like that. Very easy for a team to use. It's very visual. You can see pretty quickly where you're at. There's a little burn down chart at the bottom there, just cranked out through Excel. This is actually highly recommended as a way to manage your work as a team as opposed to a software tool. It's almost a mantra within the Agile world. It just really, really works. But if you're not co-located, then there's some tools I would suggest you consider taking a look at. There's Jean-Paul's Zest company. They've done a lot of really good work on a product called XM, or Extreme Management, which is in Plone. And there's going to be a new release shortly, which has a lot of really good goodies to make it easy to manage stuff. You can look at your iterations and drill down your stories and so on, as well as booking time. Clue Mapper, which is another good one from Jazzcarta, still early in progress, but basically built on top of Track. It doesn't have all of the Scrum goodies in it, but has all of the Track goodness that developers like. Agilito is something that our company has written, and it's still fairly new, but it's very, very simple. It's not sexy, but it really works. Trying to, again, use a very simple tool to just do what it needs to do and get out of the way. Yeah. Okay. All right. And Roadrunner, Jordan Baker's work. So thank you very much. If you'd like to discuss more. I'll be posting something on our If People blog shortly, so you can add your comments or just send me an email. Thanks.
Plone Conference 2008. We wanted to thank all the attendees for coming. We had a great time. We hope you did too. And
we also want to thank all of our volunteers, in particular the liaisons for the Plone Foundation.
Yeah, I'll post links, but
Amy Clark.